Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Matt from That's Bookshelf, and today we are continuing our road through Ulysses. We are almost done. This episode is covering pages roughly 300 to 600, and yeah, let's get into it. So, just as a reminder, we last left off Stephen Douglas on a drunken pub crawl with his friends, and we last left off Leopold Bloom having spent some time with some of his friends in a pub in Dublin, and has kind of disappeared from the plot. So this next chapter kicks off with a character who has not been introduced yet, that being Gertie Mcdowell. She is a young woman, I think in her early 20s, but it's made specific note that she is a few years older, the normal age for a woman, I guess, of her higher status to be married. She is with her two friends, and one of the friends is two younger brothers. And basically they're walking along the beach, I think, while around evening time, waiting for night for the fireworks to come on. And it's during this time that the writing style switches again. I can best compare it to Jane Austen in its sort of like elaborate and writing style. And in what it's focusing on too, Gertie lives in a sort of higher society area of Dublin, judging by the way she dresses, the way her friends dress as well, and the way her sort of mind is very much wrapped around getting married and finding a husband. And even though this is written in the third person, it's very important to make note that it is very much from the perspective of Gertie as well. You're getting her limited perspective in this, even though it's written in a sort of omnipresent sort of way. Everything that is described here is very much from Gertie's way of thinking and how she views the world. So as she's walking along the beach, Gertie describes herself as sort of like the ideal-looking Irish woman. She says she has the bluest of blue Irish eyes, long black hair. She dresses very nice, and she kind of compares herself to her friends who she thinks are not as beautiful as she is. And she is very wrapped around this guy who she was supposed to marry, and going in more with that sort of high society lifestyle. It's also a very chaste lifestyle because she recalls a time at a party where her betrothed put his arm around her, and she went pale because she was so disgusted by the act of doing that, which would become important later on in this chapter. And they walk along, and they're just basically killing time, and we get more of Gertie's perspective of the world and how, she's completely dedicated her life around finding a man to marry her. And it's, Joyce sort of commenting on the patriarchal society in Dublin at this time. And her, her whole key characteristics are her looks. But there's a little glimpse into her additional passions. She loves poetry, she loves to write poetry, but she says specifically in the text that she's willing to give up poetry if her husband does not want her to follow these pursuits, which is very tragic, and the way she kind of just very flatly states it is, this is just the world, this is how things work, is also very sad in its own right, because she's literally losing her own individuality for the sake of this patriarchal society. And then as they're walking, they notice a strange male figure in the back looming around, and Gertie's kind of enamored by him, and sort of how mysterious he is, and she starts to imagine a life with him together. And as they walk along, they notice that he's still continuing to follow them, and it gets to the point where it's nightfall and the fireworks come on, and Gertie and her friends watch the fireworks. But at one point, Gertie slips off, and she notices that the man is following her. And as the fireworks are firing off, she interacts with the man, and I will read that section as followed. Jack Caffrey shouted to look. There was another, and she leaned back, and the garters were blue to match on account of the transparent, and they all saw it and shouted to look. Look, there it was, and she leaned back ever so far to see the fireworks, and something queer was flying about through the air, a soft thing to and fro, dark. And she saw a long Roman candle going up over the trees, up, and, in the tense hush, they were all breathless with excitement, as it went higher and higher, and she had to lean back more and more to look up after it. High, almost out of sight, and her face was suffused with a divine, an entrancing blush from straining back, and he could see her other things too. The fabric that caressed the skin, better than those other petty with the green 4 and 11, on account of being white, and she let him, and she saw that he saw. Then it went so high and went out of sight. A moment, and she was trembling in every limb, from being bent so far back. He had a full view high above her knee. No one ever, not even on the swing or waiting, and she wasn't ashamed, and he wasn't either, to look in that immodest way like that, because he couldn't resist the sight of the wondrous revealment, half offered, like those skirt dancers behaving so immodest before gentlemen, looking, and he kept on looking. She would fain have cried to him chokingly, held out her snowy slender arms to him to come, to feel his lips laid on her white brow, and cry, the cry of a young girl's love. A little strangled cry wrung from her, that cry that is rung through the ages. And then a rocket sprang, and bang, shot blind, and oh, and then the Roman candle burst, and it was like a sigh of oh, and everything cried oh, oh, in raptures, and it gushed out of it a stream of rain-gold hair threads, and they shed, and ah, they were all greeny dewy stars falling with golden oh, so lively, oh, so soft, sweet, soft. Then all melted away dewily in the green air. All was silent. Ah, she glanced at him, as she bent forward quickly, a pathetic little glance of piteous protest, of shy reproach, under which he colored like a girl. He was leaning back against the rock behind. Leopold Bloom, with bowed head, before those young guileless eyes. What a brute he had been! At it again. A fair unsullied soul had called him, and, wretch that he was, how had he answered? An utter cad he had been, he of all men, but there was infinite store of mercy in those eyes, for him to a word of pardon, though he had erred and sinned and wandered. Should a girl tell? No, 1,000 times no. That was their secret, only theirs, alone, the hiding twilight, and there was none to know or to tell save the little bat that flew so softly through the evenings to and fro, and the little bats don't tell. The mysterious man is Leopold Bloom, and if it wasn't clear from the description, basically he catches him masturbating to her, and instead of being disgusted, which is what she would expect from her, both because it's not consensual and from the fact that earlier on she was apparently so appalled by the idea of a man even just putting his arm around her at a party, she sort of, subverts that expectation and pulls up her dress and lets him masturbate to her underwear, basically, and her bare legs. And you get that sort of dichotomy of how she presents herself in the narrative of being, a chaste, high society woman, but in actuality, she's, encouraging this man to masturbate to her. She finds value in it. It entices her, and you get the sort of real raw feelings that she has, the non-repressed. She's hidden away, no one can see her, and so we get the truer side of her. And I guess maybe it's like a brief period of liberation for her, but also at the same time, at the end of that passage I just read, she says that she'll never be able to tell anyone about this event because it probably would make people look down upon her. But also the surprise that it is Leopold Bloom is also very interesting because as we went on in the first episode of my Ulysses discussion, he is very, very upset with Molly's affair. So one would assume if he's upset with Molly's affair, it must mean that he is being loyal to her. But no, he's not. He is, following women around and masturbating to them, and he got lucky in this regard that she's, interested in it. We got the reveal that Leopold Bloom is a hypocrite and that he's disgusting, but it's only going to get worse as the book goes along. So it is here that we get the narrative switch back to Leopold Bloom. Starts off with Gertie in this chapter, now it's on Leopold, and as Leopold watches her, he realizes that by the way that she walks, she has a lame left leg, I believe. So she has a limp, and that's not revealed in Gertie's chapter. She specifically leaves that out. So again, another fact about her that she leaves out in the third person narrative. First being that she's not quite as pure as she wants the reader to think, and also the fact that she has a lame left leg. And you can understand why she want to hide it because, in this world, in this, patriarchal world where you have to be sort of like this pristine woman in order to get attention, having a lame left leg would probably, unfortunately would see a decline in your stock. And that is proven with Leopold Bloom because he basically says after that he's glad he finished masturbating before he noticed the lame left leg because then he kind of loses all interest in her. So it, sort of reinforces those, one-dimensional, aesthetic, shallow ideals of, this patriarchal society and how women are supposed to be, these ideal figures. So next we get to the Ox and the Sun God chapter. For those of you who don't know, this is largely considered to be the hardest chapter of Ulysses. It parallels the Odyssey in the chapter where after Odysseus and his crew sort of meet with Circe and go to Hades and then come back, and they're, given new ships and sort of have this new resolve to make it home. They land on Apollo's island, and they are specifically told by Odysseus not to eat the ox, but Odysseus leaves for a bit, and then the men who are, consumed by hunger just decide to slaughter the ox anyways, and then it causes the gods to be mad at them, and through that, Zeus destroys their ships, and all the men wash away, and Odysseus is the last of his crew to survive. So keep that in mind as we talk about this. But I have to say that this is definitely the hardest chapter for me as well. The writing style is kind of written in an older English style for the most part, and I found it to be incredibly difficult to read, but I will give my brief sort of thoughts on it. Basically, it follows Leopold as he is trying to buy time before he has to go home because he does not want to go home. And he goes to the hospital to see a woman he knows who is currently giving birth, and he's waiting in the lobby to make sure that she's okay. And in that lobby, he meets Stephen Dedalus, and they're friends. And they're all horribly, horribly drunk at this point, and you get this brief little sort of moment of sympathy from Leopold. He feels bad for Stephen seeing how drunk he is, and he sort of thinks that Stephen is kind of above his friends intellectually. And they're talking in the lobby, and they briefly talk about the ideas of the morality, I guess, of aborting the baby if the mother would die giving birth to it. And each of the characters has their own ideas. And when Leopold is asked, he says that he doesn't really answer. He doesn't really give his thoughts. He just says, well, the Catholic Church makes money on both funerals and christenings, so of course they believe that they want the baby to survive no matter what because they make money off of both ceremonies. That's what Leopold thinks, and I'm guessing that's what James Joyce thinks as well. I'm not gonna throw my 2 cents into that, but so it's not worth it. And so you get that kind of, you can kind of understand, I think, through that Leopold probably would follow the Irish government's view on it at the time, which I believe was to which is to give the woman the option of getting rid of the child and then saving her own life. And I think there is some underlining irony of it, as it is a group of men deciding what a woman should do with the baby. And so I think there's some commentary there as well, I would imagine. And the woman is giving birth, and it's a very painful birth. Specifically, it's like labor's lasting a very long period of time, and she's having a very difficult time with it, and it sort of kind of like twists Leopold's heartstrings a bit because she recalls the times that Molly gave birth and how difficult it was for her. And this is really the first time where Leopold thinks of Molly in a positive light, which is interesting. But fortunately, the woman ends up being okay, but she's not with her husband. Her husband did not show up because she justifies it by saying that they have 7 kids, so she had to take care of the other kids. But I mean, I guess there's probably a lot more commentary there of like the man just not being there while his wife is giving birth. But Leopold is there, and she's happy for this woman. And then after that, Leopold, Stephen, and their friends decide to all go out together. Leopold mostly because he is kind of taking on this more protective role. If Stephen wants to make sure he gets home okay, because he knows Simon. They were with each other earlier on in the book. He's a friend of Simon, and he watched Stephen grow up as well. So there's a sort of connection there. Think Telemachus and Odysseus, because like in the Odyssey, this is sort of the father-son reunion, except Leopold and Stephen are not actually father and son. So at this point, Stephen, Leopold, and Stephen's friends are all going out in the town, and they decide to go to a brothel. And this chapter is written in a play format, so you don't think Exiles, obviously, in which there's not a lot of descriptions. It's a lot of stage directions and like Bloom, and then his dialogue, Stephen, his dialogue, etc., etc. So this is the most like bare bones, I guess, writing style you'll get in this book. But also, this chapter is basically the deconstruction of both Leopold and Stephen, and you get to really go into you really get to see all the skeletons in their closets in this chapter, and it is very fascinating. And I will do my best to go over it broadly, but this chapter needs to be read for itself because it is a very interesting deconstruction of 2 men. Mainly Leopold, you really get to see how much of a dirtbag he kind of is and how flawed his thinking is and how much he wants to be loved without actually doing things that will make people love him. And it's great, read it, but I'll try to cover it as best as I can. So as they're going to the brothel, they briefly encounter British soldiers, which I should also mention now that at this time, Ireland was not its own country. It was still under British rule. And a lot of the general argument and points of discussion in Dublin at the time, which you see in the Conversation with a Citizen, is the idea of home rule and Irish independence. And Charles Stewart Parnell, who fought in British Parliament for home rule for Irish independence, but was ultimately, devalued as a politician and, died in sort of infamy, but he's still like a sort of like Christ-like figure among Irish nationalists in Ireland. And you see here that, Irish people are still, oppressed by the British officers on the street, and there's a lot of, animosity between the two parties. But they eventually talked out of it, and Stephen and the gang get to go to the brothel, and here is where you get the deconstruction of both the characters. And I should clarify first that the play sort of switches between reality and what's going on in the characters' heads very well. It's a very surrealist chapter. It's probably the most surrealist chapter of Ulysses, I would say. And so when I'm going through this, just keep in mind that a lot of the characters I'm talking about are not actually at the brothel, but there are a few. So just to get this out of the way, we're going to be talking about some pretty weird things, so just disclaimer there. And I should have put this at the beginning, but because, the Gertie Mcdowell thing is also, could potentially be triggering, but I just want to clarify that this is going to get into some weird subject territory, but hold on, it's going to be a bumpy ride, but in the end, as Ulysses, it's going to be worth it. So the scene in the brothel starts off going more into Leopold and his unfaithfulness to his wife. You get that first glimpse of it with Gertie Mcdowell, but here you're kind of getting the full scope of it as he's imagining himself being put on trial with the women that he committed sexual acts against, bringing them to light in front of a judge. So the first character, Mary Driscoll, is not actually there, I think. She is just, a figment of Bloom's imagination at this point, bringing up the, lewd and non-consensual acts he committed against her. Indignantly. I'm not a bad one. I bear a respectable character and was 4 months in my last place. I was in a situation, £6 a year, and my chances with Fridays out, and I had to leave owing to his carrying on. What do you tax him with? He made a certain suggestion, but I thought more of myself as poor as I am. I treated you white. I gave you mementos, smart emerald garters, far above your station. Incautiously, I took your part when you were accused of pilfering. There's a medium in all things. Play cricket. As God is looking down on me this night, if I laid my hand on them oysters. The offense complained of, did something happen? He surprised me in the rear of the premises, Your Honor, when the missus was out shopping one morning with a request for a safety pin. He held me, and I was discolored in 4 places as a result, and it interfered twixt with my clothing. So Mary O'Driscoll, as far as my aware, was the maid at the Bloom residence, and Leopold Bloom accused Mary Driscoll of stealing oysters, which ultimately got her fired by Molly, when in actuality he was getting her fired because he, tried to come on to her, and she didn't want any part of it, and ultimately he had to lie to get her out of the house. And then there are a lot of other women that, come to the stand basically and, reveal certain, unwanted sexual advances by Bloom onto them. And Bloom is on trial, and he's basically speechless at this point, but the character J.J. O'Malloy, which is his lawyer, and sort of, I guess, the subconscious justification in Bloom's own mind for what he's done, speaks in this moment and says, "This is no place for indecent levity at the expense of an erring mortal disguised in liquor. We are not in the Bear Garden, not in an Oxford rag, nor is this a travesty of justice. My client is an infant, a poor foreign immigrant who started scratch as a stowaway and is now trying to turn an honest penny. The trumped-up misdemeanor was due to a momentary aberration of heredity, brought on by hallucination, such familiarities as the alleged guilty occurrence being quite permitted in my client's native place, the land of the Pharaoh, prima facie. I put it to you that there was no attempt at carnally knowing. Intimacy did not occur, and the offense complained of by Driscoll, that her virtue was solicited, was not repeated. I would deal in especial with atavism. There have been cases of shipwreck and somnambulism in my client's family. If the accused could speak, he could a tale unfold, one of the strangest that have ever been narrated between the covers of a book. He himself, my lord, is a physical wreck from cobbler's weak chest. His submission is that of Mongolian extraction and irresponsible for his actions. Not all there, in fact." And then you get Bloom, who's just an incoherent mess, saying, "Lily poo lil chili, blingy pingfoot, everly night, pay you 2 shilly." So you get O'Malloy, which is like the logic of the internal logic of Bloom, and then the actual like feelings of Bloom after that, where he is just basically a mess. And his own defense is very interesting because he says that because first of all, like he compares himself to a child, which is not the case. He's a grown man. He's like 38 in this book, and then but also the idea that because the acts were not carnal, that means they don't count as being adulterous or anything, and it's very flawed justification. Just because he wasn't passionate about it, because he wasn't passionate about it, it means that they don't count. That it was just purely like a lustful thing, and it kind of shows that he doesn't have much respect for women in this regard, because he's assaulting them, and he says, oh, because I'm not like in love with them, or because it wasn't done carnally, that means it's okay, which is not which is a very flawed way of thinking, which is an awful way of thinking actually. And then you get like the little child part where he's which I just read, and it shows that he's what he kind of is on the inside with regards to his views on women and his treatment of women. And if you don't know, atavism and somnambulism are like two words for sleepwalking. So he's basically Omola is saying that because that these acts may have been done basically through sleepwalking, which is also not true, and completely unacceptable behavior. And then as more women come with their testimonies, they start to gather together and start thinking of punishment for Bloom because he's obviously guilty. And then I'll read this section as followed, and then you can kind of fill in the blanks as it goes on. Make him smart, Hannah dear. Give him ginger. Thrash the mongrel within an inch of his life. The cat o' nine tails. Geld him. Vivisect him. O cold, O shivery. It was your ambrosial beauty. Forget, forgive. Kismet. Let me off this once. Don't do so on any account, Mrs. Talsboy. He should be soundly trounced. I'll do no such thing, pig dog, and all is was ever since he was pupped, to dare address me. I'll flog him black and blue in the public street. I'll dig my spurs in him to the rowel. He is a well-known cuckold. Take down his trousers without a loss of time. Come here, sir. Quick. Ready? The weather has been so warm. So the women decide that they're going to punish him, and the punishments themselves are very interesting, to say the least. First, it's sort of a subconscious admittance of Bloom's guilt. Even in his fantasy, he thinks he should be punished, because even in his fantasy, he's punished, which means that he's guilty, and there's really no denying of it. But also, the punishment specifically of like the whips of cuckolding and all of that, speak to potentially like a sort of gender dysphoria, or sort of obsession with BDSM as well. He wants to be punished in specifically sexual ways. So, and it goes into it says a lot about his like stripping of his masculinity as well, as he does not feel worthy for Molly, and he does not feel like he is like a man enough. And the punishments in his mind are suiting of that. So take that as you will with the psyche of Leopold Bloom. And then, because he can't be punished for too long, Bloom in his imagination, conjures the scene of him being crowned King of Ireland, where everyone loves him, specifically women. There's three characters. There's three characters called the millionairess, the noblewoman, and the feminist, who are, saying, isn't he simply wonderful, says the millionairess. The noblewoman says, all that man has seen, and the feminist said, and done. So... So yeah, he's creating this fake event where like it's his coronation day, and like all those women from different statuses are all hailing him as being this really great man, which is simply not the case. And then it goes on for him during his coronation, he literally, the stage reaction says, placing his right hand on his testicles, swears, so may the Creator deal with me. All this I promise to do. So he's literally, how like, for like a U.S. president, they put their hand on the Bible when they're being sworn in. He's putting his hand on his testicles and basically saying he's going to act not by God's will, but by the will of his sex drive. So, yes, he is kind of, overcompensating for the first fever dream that he had, where he was, being literally put on trial for all of his, sexist acts that he did and all the sexual harassment that he did. And now he's creating an event where he's like the greatest man ever, and all the women love him, and everybody loves him, and he's a great king and ruler. But that does not last forever, because this sort of scene channels his rise and fall as the King of Ireland, and the ruler of Ireland, I should say. So basically, throughout his rise, he's sort of like pledging his allegiance to Irish nationalism and Catholicism and all of that. And then as it goes on, it gets revealed by other characters that he's not, he doesn't really believe in the things that they believe in, and they call him a liar. And he's he loses his credibility as a ruler. And then during his downfall, he makes specific note that in his imagination of his downfall, I should say, that this is what happens. Many most attractive, enthusiastic women also commit suicide by stabbing, drowning, drinking prussic acid, aconite, arsenic, opening their veins, refusing food, casting themselves under steam rollers from the top of Nelson's Pillar into the great vat of Guinness's brewery, asphyxiating themselves by placing their heads in gas ovens, hanging themselves in stylish garters, leaping from windows of different stories. So during his downfall, the women are so, they're so saddened by his fall from grace that they all kill themselves. Specifically attractive women, he makes a specific note there. So again, more misogyny, more obsession with attractive women of, being masculine, and it's just very sad, being inside of his head at this point. So even on the next page, Dr. Dixon says, Professor Bloom is a finished example of the new womanly man. And then he's about to have a baby. So after the next page, this fever dream is crazy, and it deals a lot with his troubles with masculinity, his troubles with gender, and his views of his or lack thereof views of women independence and women's rights in this section. There's really no other way to put it. So this stuff is difficult to read it to hear about. I mean, it's just a really deep dissection into the Leopold Bloom character. So this is how it is. And then concluding the Leopold Bloom deconstruction, he is met by a dominatrix whose first name Bella, but then their name is changed to Bello. And also during that transition, Bloom's sexuality is changed, his gender is changed too into a woman. He's put into women's clothes, he's forced to wear high heels. And it's another dominatrix scene where he's basically literally learning what it's like to walk in a woman's shoes. And in this role, he is a woman being abused by a man, and it's, it goes more into the BDSM obsession or fetish, potentially, and sort of getting his comeuppance in this scene, if you will want to call it that. It's a little distasteful, but that's what it is. You get Bloom, I don't know if this is a real event or not, but you get Bloom saying that he tried cross-dressing at one point. I'm not sure if that's actually happened or if that's just in the fantasy itself, but it is mentioned here, and again, more problems with, gender identification in this section. And then finally, the fantasy's over. He is, it ends with him, being the more feminine character getting abused by this dominatrix-esque character named Bello. And then it snaps back to reality. Up there goes gravity. And you get a scene of Stephen trying to smoke a cigarette, I think. And Bloom stops him and he says, "Don't smoke. You ought to eat. Cursed dog I met." To the prostitute named Zoe. "You have nothing." Another early glimpse into Bloom being potentially a father figure for Stephen, but with that transition is also the transition to Stephen's deconstruction as a character. It is a lot shorter. He's not as awful a human being as Leopold Bloom is, so we'll get into that. It'll be not as long as the Bloom section. During this time, Stephen is very, very drunk, and he's dancing around with this prostitute named Zoe, and then at this point he has the illusion of his mother coming to visit him, keeping in mind that his mother had just recently died at the start of Ulysses, and he's sort of feeling the guilt from there. And also keep in mind Richard from the play Exiles, who deals with a very similar problem, and the way the mother is described in the scene should say a lot as to how Stephen is thinking about not attending her funeral. Her face drawing near and nearer, sending out an ashen breath. "Beware." She raises her black and withered right arm slowly towards Stephen's breast with an outstretched fingers. "Beware God's hand." A green crab with malignant red eyes sticks deep its grinning claws in Stephen's heart. So you can extrapolate pretty easily that he is feeling immense guilt from the death of his mother. He's imagining her corpse haunting him, basically, and that's basically the amalgamation of his guilt for not attending her funeral. But that fantasy is relatively quick compared to the torture that Bloom is forced to endure. And then we get back to reality again, and Stephen's kind of delirious, and he smashes a lamp. And then Bello, who is the dominatrix character we talked about earlier, who is abusing Bloom, comes in and and demands that Stephen pay for it. But Bloom, in kind of like a very cool fatherly move, stands up for Stephen and says, Oh, I know, bulldog on the premises, but he's a Trinity student. Patrons of your establishment, gentlemen that pay the rent. Know what I mean, nephew of the vice-chancellor. You don't want a scandal. Trinity, coming down here ragging after a boat, racist and playing nothing. Are you my commander here? Where is he? I'll charge him, disgrace him. I will. Zoe. And if it were your own son in Oxford, I know. So he basically threatens to have a scandal in the brothel, and it sort of backs down the bellow. So then after that, Stephen and Bloom break away from both from Stephen's friends and from the brothel, and are outside, and they get into a brief spat with the British soldiers that were introduced earlier in the chapter, and it ultimately ends on a note where Bloom asks Stephen to come back to his house because he's not really at a point where he can, function. He's too drunk at this point. He's kind of delirious from the fever dream about his mother, and it's like the most fatherly Bloom has acted, and the most selflessly Bloom has acted in the book so far. So that is my, recap and my interpretation of Ulysses up to page 600-ish or so. I hope you enjoyed it. This does tackle some very complicated and abrasive subject matter, and I hope that I was able to portray it in a respectable way as best as I could. It's kind of, given that subject matter is very brutal in itself, the next section will not be as bad as this one, I will say that. Even though it's a very complicated subject matter and very, difficult subject matter to talk about, I do think that these chapters are brilliant, and I do think that the complexity of Leopold's character is like a feat in itself, a literary feat, taking away his actual viewpoints. The character himself is incredibly complex, and I found the deconstruction to be, very engaging. And if I'm wrong about some things that I'm saying, or if I'm misinterpreting some of the things, especially in that play bit when I was mentioning, it's difficult to decide what's to separate reality from imagination. So if I'm wrong in those areas, you can call me out on it, and I'll correct myself in the next video. But I think I have interpreted it in a relatively correct way, and mostly correct way. I try to make these videos as insightful as I can. I try to make sure I know what I'm talking about before I hit record. But this is a very complicated book, and obviously things can potentially be lost in translation here. And I still hope you enjoyed the video, regardless of what I had to talk about. But I think that it's important to have books like this, because I didn't know that Joyce thought so much about gender and about patriarchal society, and how women are subjected in this society in Dublin at this time, especially by a man who's so selfishly minded like Leopold. And I'm glad that I ultimately read it, even though at times it's difficult to read about, and it's very difficult to talk about as well, because I'm not particularly learned on this subject matter. And but still, I still think it's worth talking about, because I don't really see anyone else. There are a few other YouTube channels talking about Ulysses, but I think that I'm kind of an exception here, where I'm really going in depth onto the book based on my own interpretations of it. I do my research as well, but I try to go in, at least in the first read, as blind as possible, because I don't see much value in knowing what happens in the book before I actually read it. And this is definitely standing out as being one of my favorite books probably ever. It's definitely the most interesting book I've ever read, both with its transition and writing styles, and its ability to create an accurate scene of what Ireland was like, what Dublin was like in one very specific day. From political, from a gender relations sort of view, it basically covers so much about Dublin society at this time, and it's fascinating to read. And yes, one more video on Ulysses, I think. Well, I'll be covering the last 200-ish pages of the book, and that'll be coming pretty soon, and probably within a week or two after this video comes up. You can check that out as well, and let me know what you think about Ulysses so far if you're reading it, and if this series is helping you, and if my interpretation is helping you. And if I'm wrong, please point out, because I want to be corrected. I want to understand this book as best as I possibly can. So thank you for making it this far. If you did, I don't really blame if you didn't, but if you did, thank you so much, and I'll see you hopefully in the next Ulysses video. Also, check out my friends Colorless Wonderland and Drunzo and Film Frauds. Drunzo is back, so you can stop asking me about Drunzo, thankfully. And thank you for making it this far, and goodbye.